Hi, I'm Donnan and I'm a third-year doctoral student in the Faculty of Education and Social Work, and I'm presenting on my thesis, New Zealand Young Carers Speak. I am going to sit down because I'm 7 months pregnant. I seem to get quite breathless, so please excuse that. Okay. So today I'm going to share with you how my thesis identified an invisible population, accessed their voices, and brought about change. I want to begin with a story. When I was 14 years old, my mum passed away, and because my dad was an international flight attendant, a lot of the time it was just my older brother and I at home. Now, my brother has autism and an intellectual disability, so that meant a lot of the time it was my responsibility to make sure that he showered, give him medication, and do the cooking. Back then I thought that I was the only young person carrying out this kind of role at a young age. So I never told anyone. I was really lonely. It wasn't until a few years ago that I stumbled across an article and discovered I was a young carer. A young carer is a child or youth aged up to 25 years, providing significant and ongoing support for someone with a disability, illness, substance misuse, or who's elderly. All of a sudden, I wasn't alone. In fact, I learnt that I was one of 40,000 18 to 24-year-olds providing care in New Zealand. However, this is the only statistic that we have about young carers in New Zealand. Furthermore, international literature says that most young carers, like myself, are actually younger than 18 years old. So imagine how many more of us there must be. Now, we don't know much in New Zealand, but international literature paints a broader picture. It shows that young carers are an invisible population, that they experience fewer opportunities to socialise, lower educational achievement, and greater unemployment than their peers, and they experience negative emotions such as guilt, anger, and frustration. But what do we know in New Zealand? There's no policy, no services, and just 4 published studies, all of which point to the importance of research into this vulnerable and hidden population. And that's where my thesis comes in. My thesis asks the question, what does it mean to be a young carer in New Zealand? And aims to gather the experiences and needs of young carers, as told by the young carers themselves. The overarching purpose of my thesis is to use young carers' voices to bring about policies and services that will meet their needs. But how do you find an invisible population? I want you to think back to Where's Wally and how hard he was to find on the busy pages of those picture books. Now imagine if Wally doesn't actually realise that you're trying to find him, and how much more difficult that might be. The international literature suggested that it was going to be hard finding participants for my research, but it didn't offer any creative ways to go about it. So I began my recruitment with fairly traditional sampling methods such as posters, but it didn't take long for me to realise that a title such as Hey Young Carers wasn't going to work because young carers themselves didn't know that they were young carers. So I thought back to how I learnt that I was a young carer, and that was through reading an article. And I decided to make a video about my own experience as a young carer, in the hope that young carers would see the video, self-identify, and come forward to be part of my research. I used social media and shared the video, and like a snowball building momentum, the video was shared and shared again, until eventually I had 35 young carer participants. Now, the 4 New Zealand studies point out the importance of having a broad range of young carers in your research. My young carers were diverse not only in their gender, but in the age that they started caring, on average 10 years old, in their culture, and in their location throughout New Zealand. They were further diverse in the number of people they cared for, in who they cared for, whether it was a parent or a sibling, and in the care need of that person, from alcohol misuse to intellectual disability. Each young carer took part in one interview with me on a one-on-one basis. I recommended an hour maximum per interview, but interviews often took up to 2 hours because young carers told me this was the first time that anyone had asked them about their experience. The key to my interviews was young carers themselves defining what was important to talk about within the boundary of young caring, so that I could understand what young caring meant to them. I analysed the interviews by writing out or transcribing the 35 voices, and then pulling out the key themes, the key similarities and differences inherent in those interviews, and weaving those together to tell one story, my thesis, of what it means to be a young carer. Now, I said at the beginning of this presentation that I identified a hidden population and accessed their voices, which I've covered so far. But then I said that the overarching purpose was to use young carers' voices to bring about change. So what have I done? First of all, I'm going to share with you 2 key findings, and then I'll show you how I've addressed policy and services. My first key finding was that young carers felt like they were being both a child and an adult. They talked of having these adult-like roles, such as injecting morphine for their mother or changing their grandparents' nappies. But they said that when they went to appointments with their care recipient, such as the GP, they were treated like a child and they weren't given information they needed to successfully carry out their caring roles. Just like the international literature said that young carers experience negative emotions, so did the young carers in my study, feeling anger at frustration at this dichotomy between being an adult and being a child. However, they said they truly valued their young caring roles for the bond it created with their care recipient, who may actually not have a lot of time left. Young carers were very clear on their need for information about the care recipient's disability or illness, for training in how to carry out their care tasks, and for direction, where to go when they weren't coping. A second key finding was young carers having fewer opportunities to socialise, which directly aligns with the international literature. However, young carers in my study spoke of it in terms of a loss of freedom compared to their peers, which extended to their dating lives, which were practically non-existent. Just as I felt lonely, so did the young carers in my study, speaking of a sense of isolation. But they also pointed out that they gained a sense of maturity that their peers never gained. They said that they needed a pause, the chance to take a break and do normal child or teenage activities, and they desperately wanted to meet other young carers. So what did I do with my findings? At the service level, together with Carers New Zealand, I created a non-profit organisation called Young Carers New Zealand. Now, we're just in our infancy, but already we have a Facebook page with over 2,000 likes and an advisory group made up of young carers, so they have an ongoing voice beyond my thesis in matters that concern them. In the future, we'll have counselling, respite and socialising opportunities. At the policy level, I worked together with the Ministry of Social Development to come up with the first piece of young carer legislation, and I wrote an evidence brief about the needs of young carers to inform future policy decision making. Internationally, the voices of New Zealand young carers can now be added to the international conversation going on about young caring. But furthermore, I've shown how a creative methodology can help other countries to access young carers, such as the US and Canada, where little research has been done. I want you to think back to the beginning of this presentation, where I told you that I felt lonely and isolated in my caring role. Can you imagine if there had have been services available so I could have met other young carers, had some training, and understood that I wasn't the only one? How different might my life have been then? Within the scope of a PhD thesis, I'm obviously limited by time and funding. So imagine what can be done outside the scope of a PhD. All I can say is watch this space, because you're about to see a whole lot more young carers who are no longer hidden and no longer isolated. Thank you very much. Are there any questions at all? Yes.
So yeah, I'm just I think it's very interesting study. Obviously, I think it's a really good idea to get out there and get people's perspectives and learn, from challenging situations. But I'd also be very curious to see what the results would be when you compare non-caring young people and their responses, and actually, if you can pick up whether there are other groups in society that also feel the same way, or whether actually the carers have strengths and positives that they gain from this. I don't know. I'm just wondering because until you actually have done gotten the responses from non-caring people, you can't really assume that it's the fact that they're a carer that makes their response a certain way. So I don't know, that's just something, I don't know, maybe you've already considered this. I'm curious.
It's an interesting point. I think any research you choose a methodology that will support the kind of research you're carrying out. So the methodology that I chose is more about just accessing the group you're interested in and their particular voices. I think because young caring is so hidden, and this is some of the first research being done, it's really important that the first thing we do is access the young carers' voices because they're not being heard. But in the future, there's such a huge opportunity to extend this research wider, not only to compare it to non-caring groups, for instance, but to do some quantitative research and learn more about the numbers of young carers, to learn about caring within specific cultural groups, which came through as a big finding in my research, that different cultural groups look at young caring differently. So you're absolutely right, there's a lot more work to be done, and within my little thesis, this is what I've done so far, but thank you, I appreciate your feedback.
There's a lot of questions here. You mentioned that there tends to be more unemployment with young carers, which I guess is, lack of time to actually build the skills that employers are looking for. But I was wondering if possibly there was some way to maybe develop the skills that they've gained in being young carers to maybe help raise the employment?
Yes, yeah, that's a great point. That took me a lot longer to get to than one presentation. What Young Carers New Zealand would love to do is to implement some of the things that have happened in Australia and the UK, where young carers may have to leave school early or they may not be able to attend university, but they're gaining these incredible capacities along the way that, if utilised correctly, could result in being wonderful employees. And so having training programs or certification to identify the skills that they do have, so that when the day comes that their caring role ends, for whatever reason, whether that is the end of their care recipient's life or they enter a rest home or a hospital, that the young carer isn't left with a CV that says they dropped out of school at a young age and did nothing. So definitely looking at how we address that is really important. The young carers often, the literature shows, get into jobs in the caring profession, so it's also important to balance that they have a choice about their job, because they may not want to spend their life as a carer, but it just happens to be what they're good at. So it's providing those training opportunities, but balancing that with opportunities to be something else as well, if that's what they desire.
So you think it's something that can be addressed at the policy level? I know, say with design, you might be able to say, oh, look, I have this amount of experience, so they might enter a higher level of study, as opposed to if they didn't have any prior experience. So do you think this is something that could be addressed?
Yes, absolutely. And I think an instance of something that's been done in Australia recently is they implemented a bursary for young carers, so that where their family was struggling to maintain school fees or uniforms and higher education, that they can apply for a bursary, so just financially supporting them. So I think there's a lot that can be done at the policy level to help young carers to stay in education and have those opportunities.
I was going to ask about the finances.
Yes.
I imagine some of these people who've been caring don't know how or where to go for help financially.
No. And imagine if you're a family who's not from New Zealand. I mean, for my young carers, where their families were, say, from the Pacific Islands, and the young carer was the only family member who spoke English, it's then our responsibility to access the services. And how can you expect a young person to not only know where to go, but what to say and to be taken seriously? So that's a real key of services coming to families rather than the other way round, where families have to go out and try and find services.
Has the government been sort of helpful?
Yes, absolutely. And the ministry commissioned me to do the evidence brief on young carers' needs, which was fantastic. But that was more directed towards the information needs of young carers. And it would be good if we could go a bit wider now to look at the other needs of young carers, and wider again to the needs of their families. So the support so far from the ministry has been wonderful.